Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating and paying our hardworking staff. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay their living expenses and continue bringing you great content. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. They always thought we were fragile. They looked at our soft skin, our flat teeth, and our lack of natural armor. And they laughed, to the apex predators of the galaxy. A human was nothing more than a frail herbivore meant to hide in the rear echelons. But out here, where the ice burns and the blood freezes, they were about to learn what happens when a herbivore gets hungry. The abandoned signal station sat buried deep within a glacial valley on the frozen hellscape of planet Xylo 9. It was a sprawling graveyard of twisted metal and howling winds. A place where temperatures dropped so incredibly low that the air itself felt like shattered glass in the lungs. A brutal, relentless blizzard tore through the jagged peaks, completely obscuring the horizon in a dense sheet of blinding white. Pushing through this lethal storm was an elite task force of the Volari race. These were magnificent, towering beings, standing a full 3 meters tall. Their massive bodies were encased in a thick, naturally occurring dermal armor that gleamed like polished obsidian beneath the frost. Born with razor-sharp claws and the primal instincts of apex hunters, the Volari were sent here on a high-risk data retrieval mission. To them, the lethal cold was merely an inconvenience, a slight chill against their formidable biology. Trailing a long way behind these massive warriors was Freddie Butler, the only mechanical engineer assigned to the squad, wrapped heavily in multiple layers of bulky thermal fabric. Freddie looked absurdly small in the golden, slitted eyes of the Volari. He was little more than a cloth-wrapped mascot. They firmly believed that humans were tiny, weak herbivores. Mankind had no fangs, no claws, and absolutely no natural plating to protect their soft internal organs from the harsh realities of the universe. To the Volari, humanity was a species fit only for safe, technical labor far behind the active front lines. Whenever Freddie struggled through the thigh-deep snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the alien soldiers exchanged amused snorts. They tolerated his presence strictly because he possessed the fine motor skills required to extract the corrupted data drives from the frozen consoles. In their minds, he was a liability they were forced to babysit. Then, the solid ice beneath them exploded. Without a single warning sound, a massive pack of cryostalkers erupted from the deep permafrost. These indigenous predators were colossal nightmares of dense muscle and bone, heavily plated in thick layers of glacial ice that served as an impenetrable organic armor. They were completely silent, lightning fast, and ruthlessly efficient. In mere seconds, the pristine Volari defensive formation was torn to bloody shreds. A cryostalker lunged from the whiteout conditions, its massive jaws snapping a Volari warrior in half before the alien could even unholster his heavy plasma rifle. Bright blue blood sprayed violently across the pristine snow, instantly freezing into macabre, jagged crystals. The deafening roars of the beasts echoed against the valley walls, completely drowning out the frantic tactical commands of the Volari squad leader. The ambush was absolute, a brutal slaughter born directly from the freezing depths of the hostile planet. "Fall back into the ravine!" the Volari commander bellowed, his deep voice vibrating with a very rare sense of panic. The surviving squad members immediately broke rank, forced into a desperate retreat toward a narrow, jagged cave system they had bypassed just an hour earlier. Freddie scrambled frantically over sharp rocks, his lungs burning with every agonizing breath. He slipped on the slick ice, his heavy toolkit dragging him down toward the waiting jaws. But a towering Volari grabbed him by the tactical harness and hurled him violently forward. In the chaotic, Blind stampede. Their vital supplies were utterly crushed. A stray swipe from a cryostalker tail obliterated the main communication relay on the back of the radio man, shattering it into useless sparks and flying metal. The medical drone, carrying their regenerative gels and thermal boosters, was stomped into flat metal beneath the heel of a retreating Valeri. They were completely cut off, stripped of their lifelines, and bleeding out in the snow, diving into the claustrophobic darkness of the narrow cave. The surviving Valeri warriors turned to make a final, desperate stand. The entrance was far too wide to defend against a full pack of those monsters, using every single ounce of their immense genetic strength. 4 Valeri warriors hauled the massive, bleeding carcass of a cryostalker they had just managed to kill. They dragged the multi-ton beast across the uneven rocky floor, wedging its heavily armored bulk horizontally across the cave mouth. The makeshift flesh barricade blocked the howling wind and the snapping jaws of the ravenous pack outside, but it effectively sealed them inside a dark tomb. Inside the cavern, the air quickly grew thick and impossibly heavy, suffocatingly saturated with the metallic stench of alien blood and the bitter smell of sheer, unadulterated despair. The pitch-black darkness closed in around them, and for the very first time in their glorious, undefeated history, the Valeri hunters felt the icy grip of absolute terror. The structural integrity of the cavern was profoundly compromised by the frantic retreat. As the towering Valeri warriors shoved the massive, bleeding beast against the opening, violent kinetic vibrations traveled rapidly up the jagged limestone walls. Freddy stepped forward, raising his heavy hydraulic wrench to secure a damaged metallic support strut near the ceiling. He never saw the deep fracture line expanding directly above him in the darkness. A dense chunk of freezing granite, weighing well over 200 pounds, snapped loose from the cavern roof. It plummeted downward with terrifying velocity, striking the rocky floor and rolling directly onto Freddy's left lower leg. The sound of the impact was sickening, a wet, heavy crunch that echoed loudly over the howling wind outside. The sheer kinetic force pulverized his insulated boot and completely crushed the fragile human anatomy trapped inside. Freddy collapsed violently against the freezing cave floor. A blinding wave of pure, white-hot agony surged from his pulverized shin straight to his brain, threatening to rip a desperate, primal scream from his lungs. Instead, he shoved a thick fold of his heavy thermal collar deep into his mouth and bit down with everything he had. The sharp, copper taste of his own blood immediately flooded his tongue. He knew any loud vocalization would instantly frenzy the pack of monsters still tearing at the barricade just a few feet away. Cold, clammy sweat erupted across his pale forehead, instantly freezing into microscopic ice crystals against his skin. His vision swam in a violent sea of red and black, but he did not make a single sound. The squad's chief medical officer crouched heavily beside him, his massive armored frame completely dwarfing the injured engineer. The alien warrior withdrew a smooth, obsidian diagnostic cylinder from his tactical waist belt. A harsh, violet beam of light washed over Freddy's mangled leg, projecting a 3-dimensional holographic rendering of the internal tissue damage into the dim air. The Valeri medic let out a low, rumbling sigh and slowly shook his head in absolute resignation. The scan was catastrophic. The human tibia and fibula were not just broken. They were comprehensively shattered into dozens of jagged, disconnected fragments. Sharp shards of calcium were dangerously close to severing major arterial pathways, and a massive internal hematoma was already swelling rapidly beneath the synthetic fabric of his suit. "It is crushed beyond natural repair," the medic stated coldly, his deep voice devoid of any comforting inflection. For a Valeri, a severely crushed limb was merely a temporary tactical disadvantage. Their biology utilized a highly advanced system of electromagnetic cellular regeneration. By consciously redirecting their internal bioelectric currents, A Volari warrior could force severed bone fragments to fuse and knit back together seamlessly in a matter of hours. Humanity possessed absolutely no such evolutionary luxury. Human healing was a slow, messy, and agonizingly primitive biochemical process that required perfectly sterile environments and highly advanced synthetic medical gels to reconstruct shattered bone tissue. Since the squad's entire supply of regenerative gel had been stomped into the snow during the ambush outside, the medical prognosis was utterly grim. In this brutally freezing environment, with compromised blood vessels and raw marrow leaking dangerously into the surrounding muscle tissue, the medic viewed the severe injury as an absolute, undeniable death sentence. Outside the sealed entrance, the violent ice storm escalated significantly. The atmospheric pressure plummeted as the planetary blizzard reached a deadly Category 5 intensity. The ambient temperature inside the dark cave rapidly dropped toward 40 degrees below zero. Recognizing the imminent threat of freezing to death, the Volari squad leader issued a series of sharp, clicking vocal commands. The towering alien warriors immediately moved to the deepest, most sheltered corners of the cavern and adopted synchronized kneeling postures. To survive the lethal cold, their reptilian species relied on a highly specialized biological failsafe. They deliberately slowed their massive hearts to a mere 4 beats per minute, drastically dropped their core body temperatures, and entered a deep state of short-term biological hibernation. As their thick, interlocking scales shifted and locked together to form a perfect thermal seal, they looked down at Freddy one last time. Their glowing golden eyes held nothing but profound, tragic pity. They were absolutely certain that this tiny, fragile herbivore would succumb to hypothermic shock and massive internal blood loss long before the morning sun ever touched the horizon. As the last Volari warrior closed his heavy eyes and fell into a deep, statuesque stillness, Freddy was left completely alone in the suffocating, freezing darkness. The excruciating pain radiating from his crushed leg was no longer just an injury. It was a living, breathing entity, actively attempting to devour his sanity. Every single pulse of his racing heart sent a fresh wave of blinding torture shooting up his spinal cord. But the physical pain was only the beginning of his nightmare. The absolute, soul-crushing cold of the alien world began to seep viciously through the torn layers of his thermal suit. His core temperature was dropping at a terrifying speed. Violent, uncontrollable shivering racked his small frame as his central nervous system desperately attempted to generate friction heat. His highly analytical engineer's brain detached slightly from the overwhelming panic and objectively assessed the physiological crisis. Hypovolemic shock was rapidly setting in. His body was actively burning through its remaining energy reserves at a terrifying, unsustainable rate just to keep his vital organs from shutting down completely. He knew exactly what his failing biology demanded to survive the night. He needed fuel. He required a massive, immediate influx of raw, dense calories to violently kickstart his adrenaline production, elevate his core temperature, and force his immune system into a state of hyperactive shock response. Without a colossal source of external energy, his human heart would simply stop beating within the next 30 minutes. Lying helplessly in the frozen dirt, hovering precariously on the absolute razor's edge between life and death, Freddy forced his heavy eyelids open. His blurred, tear-streaked vision pierced the oppressive gloom and locked directly onto the massive, shadowy silhouette blocking the cave entrance. It was the fresh carcass of the enormous cryostalker they had dragged inside. The beast lay completely motionless, its terrifying, razor-sharp jaws slightly parted, leaking a thick, dark, metallic-smelling fluid onto the stone. The rich, heavy scent of alien blood filled the confined space, overpowering the smell of ozone and fear. In that defining, desperate moment, the thin veneer of the civilized human engineer burned away entirely. Stripped of his advanced technology, stripped of his heavily armed backup, and pushed far beyond the absolute limits of civilized endurance. The most ancient, primal survival instinct of mankind violently awoke deep within his chest. Every single millimeter of forward movement was an excruciating, agonizing negotiation with gravity and sheer physical trauma. Freddy dug his thick, heavily insulated gloves directly into the unforgiving, razor-sharp frost coating the uneven cavern floor. He dragged his utterly ruined lower half forward, leaving a thick, steaming, unmistakable trail of dark, red arterial blood smeared across the pale limestone. The massive, lifeless carcass of the apex predator loomed ahead in the suffocating darkness, like a fallen biological monument to the planet's cruelty. It took him nearly 10 agonizing minutes of pure, unadulterated willpower to cross a distance of barely 15 feet. When his exhausted upper body finally collapsed against the beast's armored flank, the sheer residual cold radiating from its thick, reptilian scales threatened to violently extinguish the last flickering remnants of his consciousness. But the ancient, primitive fire burning fiercely behind his retinas absolutely refused to be put out. His trembling, blood-stained fingers fumbled blindly at his heavy tactical belt, eventually closing around the freezing, metallic grip of his industrial-grade hydraulic wrench. This specific piece of heavy machinery was heavily modified and specifically designed to torque massive starship engine mounts and shear straight through reinforced durasteel hull plating. With agonizing slowness, ignoring the blinding flashes of pain threatening to shut down his brain, he hauled his upper torso directly over the beast's sprawling, muscular hind leg. The creature's primary femur was utterly monstrous, easily as thick as a mature oak tree trunk and entirely encased in thick, rigid layers of frost-bitten alien muscle. Freddy manually engaged the wrench's primary safety release valve, aggressively ratcheting the heavy, serrated metallic jaws open to their absolute maximum width. With a final, desperate heave, he clamped the vibrating, heavy-duty tool directly around the exact center of the colossal bone. He completely bypassed the standard safety limiters with a frantic, bloody swipe of his thumb, forcing the compact fusion cell of the tool to dump exactly 100% of its remaining energy reserve directly into the pneumatic servos. A high-pitched, mechanical shriek violently tore through the heavy, suffocating silence of the cavern as the hydraulic rams aggressively engaged. The industrial tool strained immensely against the incredible biological density of the alien predator. The internal motor, whining at a deafening, metallic pitch that vibrated right through the dense rock beneath him. The immense, crushing pressure rapidly escalated, breaching the critical structural threshold of the organic material. A thunderous, concussive crack violently ruptured the dead air. It sounded exactly like a massive tectonic plate fracturing under pressure. A brutal, wet explosion of splintering organic matter that echoed endlessly off the claustrophobic limestone walls. The sheer auditory violence of the bone fracture acted exactly like a physical blow, instantly and completely disrupting the delicate biological stasis of the cornered squad. Across the dark, freezing cavern, the heavy, armored eyelids of several alien warriors snapped completely open in absolute shock. Their shallow, desperately needed hibernation state was brutally and violently severed by the explosive noise, dragging their sluggish, freezing minds violently back into the waking nightmare of the cave. What those towering, elite alien soldiers witnessed next fundamentally and permanently shattered their entire evolutionary comprehension of the universe. They fully expected to see the frail, soft-skinned engineer crushed to death under a collapsing rock, or finally succumbing quietly to his horrific, bleeding wounds. Instead, their glowing, reptilian golden eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. The tiny, fragile creature they had mocked relentlessly as a weak, harmless herbivore was currently straddling the severed, bloody limb of the most feared apex predator on the entire frozen planet. The industrial hydraulic wrench had cleanly and violently sheared the massive femur completely in half, entirely exposing the dark, steaming interior of the cavernous bone cavity. Freddy plunged his bare, freezing hands directly into the jagged, broken crater of shattered cartilage. His pale fingers dug frantically and viciously through the thick, spongy layers of internal tissue, scooping out huge, dripping handfuls of the creature's core biological essence. It was a dense, highly gelatinous marrow, glowing softly, with a sickly, golden luminescence, and heavily marbled with thick, sticky ribbons of neon blue alien blood. It looked exactly like toxic, radioactive sludge, actively pulsating with the residual chemical energy of the dead beast. Without a single second of hesitation, without any trace of civilization, refinement, or hesitation, the human brought the massive, dripping mass of raw, steaming tissue straight to his face and shoved it violently into his mouth. He swallowed the grotesque, alien substance whole, his jaw working with a desperate, terrifyingly animalistic ferocity that defied logic. The squad commander jerked upright against the cave wall, his massive, scaled joints groaning loudly in severe biological protest against the lethal, freezing cold. Pure panic, a completely foreign and deeply unsettling emotion to the hardened, veteran warrior, seized his twin alien hearts in a vice grip. He desperately attempted to lunge forward, intending to physically rip the highly toxic sludge from the frantic engineer's hands. But his dormant, freezing muscles completely refused to respond fast enough to his neurological commands. He knew the complex biological makeup of that specific monster intimately. The raw meat and internal marrow of that particular species contained impossibly high concentrations of heavy metal acids, a highly volatile and extremely dangerous chemical cocktail biologically designed to digest frozen rock and raw, unrefined planetary minerals. To nearly 99.9% of all carbon-based life forms in the known, charted galaxy, that glowing golden marrow was an incredibly corrosive, instantly lethal poison, capable of melting delicate internal organs into liquid ash within a matter of mere minutes. The horrified commander was absolutely, fundamentally certain that the agonizing, unbearable pain of the crushed leg had finally and permanently shattered the fragile human psyche. He truly and deeply believed the small, pitiful creature had gone completely, irreversibly mad and was intentionally choosing a horrific, agonizing chemical suicide over slowly freezing to death in the terrifying dark. But Freddy did not violently convulse. He did not vomit boiling, acidic blood, nor did he collapse onto the stone floor in a gruesome chemical death rattle. Instead, he chewed ravenously, the sickening, wet, heavily pronounced sounds of his desperate mastication entirely filling the shocked, dead silence of the freezing cave. He swallowed another massive, dripping clump of raw, glowing marrow, his throat working incredibly hard to physically force the dense, thick material down into his empty stomach. He paused his frantic feasting, only to aggressively wipe his chin with the back of his heavily bloodied hand, casually licking a thick, viscous smear of glowing blue fat directly from the corner of his cracked, freezing lips. When he finally looked up from the carcass and locked eyes with the completely paralyzed alien commander, his human eyes were completely wild, deeply bloodshot, and utterly devoid of the meek, polite, submissive demeanor of a lowly fleet mechanic. Yet, his voice, though extremely raspy, raw, and heavily strained from the cold, was chillingly calm, highly analytical, and entirely rational. "The human stomach," Freddy gasped out, taking another ragged, painful breath of the freezing air, "contains a highly concentrated, naturally occurring pool of extremely strong hydrochloric acid. It is literally one of the most aggressive and violently corrosive digestive solvents naturally found anywhere in nature. A little bit of indigenous heavy metal cannot kill me. It will barely even give me mild heartburn. And this incredibly dense, highly caloric raw bone marrow is exactly what our primitive, remarkably stubborn species naturally uses to force our biology to hyper-accelerate cellular growth and permanently heal massive skeletal fractures. The biochemical reaction occurring inside the dark, cramped cavern was instantaneous, violently spectacular, and defied every single known principle of extraterrestrial medicine. Instead of collapsing onto the freezing stone floor in a foaming, toxic death rattle, the extreme concentration of heavy alien proteins and dense, uncharted planetary minerals hit the churning, highly acidic cauldron of human stomach fluid, exactly like a massive solar flare striking a volatile gas giant. Mixed intimately with the massive, unyielding flood of survival adrenaline already pumping frantically through his terrified circulatory system. The supposedly lethal marrow triggered a catastrophic, hyper-metabolic cascade. Freddy threw his head back against the jagged rocks, letting out a raw, guttural gasp as an intense, localized chemical synthesis ignited deep within his core. His human biology, molded and hardened over millions of brutal, unforgiving years on a highly volatile planet to extract vital sustenance from literally anything it could successfully scavenge, eagerly weaponize the alien nutrients. Within just 60 agonizing seconds, his rapidly failing cardiovascular system shifted into absolute maximum overdrive. He effectively transformed into a miniature, biological thermal reactor. The thick layers of crystalline frost desperately clinging to his pale skin rapidly melted into heavy streams of warm sweat, instantly evaporating into thick, billowing clouds of vapor that radiated powerfully off his shoulders in the freezing, dead air. His internal core temperature spiked drastically, violently overriding and completely obliterating the deadly hypothermic shock that had threatened to quietly claim his life merely moments before. Surging wildly with a terrifying, unnatural heat and a massive, overwhelming spike of manic energy, Freddy turned his sharp, predatory attention directly back to his completely ruined left leg. He grabbed the heavy industrial hydraulic wrench once again, bringing the solid metallic head down viciously and repeatedly on the remaining jagged fragments of the shattered alien femur. He ruthlessly smashed the dense, armored organic material until several long, incredibly sharp, rigid splinters of thick bone snapped cleanly free. Grabbing these jagged, blood-stained alien shards with trembling but fiercely determined hands, he did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. With a sickening, wet crunch that echoed terribly in the dark, he brutally drove the sharp, makeshift organic splints straight through the thick layers of his heavy thermal trousers and violently deep into his own torn, agonizing flesh. He aggressively forced the shattered, disorganized fragments of his human tibia back into a crude, agonizingly straight, structural alignment. He clamped his teeth together so incredibly hard that his soft gums actively bled, securely binding the horrific, protruding splints tightly with thick, unyielding strips of reinforced tactical webbing torn violently from his equipment vest. Underneath the bloody, ruined fabric, fueled directly by the massive, mutant influx of raw alien calcium and raw bioelectric energy, his previously dormant osteoblasts exploded into a state of hyperactive frenzy. The slow, methodical human process of osteogenesis, normally requiring several agonizing weeks of slow, delicate recovery, was aggressively hijacked by the extreme nutritional shock, actively and forcefully compelling the pulverized bone structure to rapidly knit together in a desperate, fiery display of sheer evolutionary stubbornness. Watching this brutally visceral, horrific display of unanesthetized self-surgery from the freezing, pitch-black shadows, the veteran Valeri squad commander physically recoiled, pressing his massive, heavily armored back tightly against the jagged limestone cave wall. His entire, deeply ingrained cosmological worldview violently and permanently collapsed into useless dust. The absolute, undeniable truth of Earth's brutal evolutionary history crashed heavily upon the towering alien warrior with the terrifying, crushing weight of a dying star. The small, panting creature, sitting just a few feet before him, casually wiping glowing, toxic alien blood from his steaming, sweat-drenched face, was absolutely not a domesticated, weak, defenseless herbivore. Humanity was an apex pursuit predator, an incredibly dangerous species of relentless persistence hunters, birthed directly on a chaotic, high-gravity death world. They were the galaxy's ultimate, unyielding omnivores. Biological engines of pure defiance, purposefully designed by nature to consume absolutely anything they could successfully kill or scavenge just to guarantee their survival for another single day. The towering Volari hunted solely for cultural glory and tactical honor, relying heavily on their immense natural armor and genetically inherited weapons. But these tiny humans hunted out of sheer, unadulterated, desperate necessity, armed with absolutely nothing but soft, vulnerable flesh, highly adaptable, intensely corrosive digestive tracts, and a terrifying, uncompromising refusal to simply lay down and die. Fully energized by the roaring, unnatural chemical fire blazing through his veins, Freddy's highly analytical engineer mind violently shifted gears, moving instantly from basic biological survival to advanced tactical escape. He stared intensely at the faintly glowing, severed neural bundles still twitching weakly inside the hollowed-out alien bone cavity. A completely insane, fundamentally unhinged, yet perfectly mathematically sound engineering theory formed rapidly in his desperate, hyperactive brain, ripping his personal, heavily damaged communication device directly from his utility belt. He aggressively cracked open the reinforced rear casing, completely exposing the severely burnt-out power nodes. He reached deep into the cavernous, bloody depths of the dead alien carcass, brutally ripping out long, thick, gelatinous strands of its highly conductive, luminescent nervous system, working with the manic, terrifying speed of an absolute madman. He stripped the tough bioelectric insulation from the nerves, using only his bare, bloody teeth, meticulously splicing the raw, pulsating organic cables directly into the delicate metallic circuitry of his broken radio. Utilizing the hollowed-out, bowl-shaped chunk of alien bone as a crude, heavy-duty containment casing, he purposefully flooded the impromptu chamber with the highly acidic, remaining marrow fluid, actively mixing it with a handful of crushed copper wiring. He effectively created a highly unstable, deeply volatile, but incredibly potent biological galvanic cell. He violently slammed the final, glowing nerve cluster directly onto the makeshift positive terminal. The dead communicator instantly and aggressively shrieked back to life, its small, cracked monitor illuminating the dark, bloody cavern with a harsh, glaring green glow. Freddy frantically dialed in the primary emergency distress frequency, slamming his bloody thumb down hard onto the broadcast module. The automated distress beacon successfully punched straight through the severe planetary atmospheric interference, sending a highly compressed, encrypted data packet soaring brilliantly into the upper atmosphere toward the orbiting fleet. However, the improvised, highly reactive biological power core did not merely transmit a standard, clean radio wave. The raw, unfiltered alien chemical energy violently mutated the signal transmission, aggressively broadcasting a piercing, ultra-high-frequency sonic pulse directly into the surrounding frozen valley. It was a chaotic frequency, completely inaudible to human ears. But to the massive, ravenous pack of heavily armored monsters prowling aggressively just outside the barricade, it was a deafening, absolutely maddening alarm. A terrifying, unified chorus of deafening, Blood-curdling howls instantly erupted from the blinding white blizzard outside. The massive, razor-sharp claws of the completely enraged beast swarm violently struck the frozen stone barricade, desperately and furiously tearing at the jagged rocks with a renewed, utterly frenzied bloodlust that shook the entire cave system to its very foundations. The massive, frozen carcass, wedged into the cave entrance, groaned under a terrifying, incalculable amount of external kinetic pressure. Jagged cracks rapidly spiderwebbed across the surrounding limestone archway as the enraged pack of alien predators relentlessly battered the barricade from the outside. Thick chunks of heavy granite ceiling collapsed, raining sharp debris onto the cavern floor. Inside the claustrophobic darkness, the elite Valeri warriors were utterly defenseless. The violent, premature severing of their biological hibernation cycle had left their towering forms completely crippled. Their massive, armored limbs trembled violently, heavily afflicted by profound cellular lethargy and severe neural lag. The squad commander desperately attempted to raise his heavy plasma rifle, his thick, reptilian fingers completely numb and unresponsive. The weapon emitted a pathetic, dying click as the completely drained thermal battery fully failed. The towering alien soldiers, revered as the apex combatants of the known galaxy, collapsed weakly against the jagged cave walls. They were completely paralyzed by a combination of extreme hypothermia and biological shock. Absolute, unavoidable death hung heavily in the freezing air, mere inches away from tearing their throats out. With a final, ear-splitting roar of shattering bone and tearing flesh, the makeshift barricade violently imploded. 3 colossal alien beasts, each weighing easily over 3,000 pounds, tore through the massive gap, their heavily armored claws gouging deep, permanent trenches into the solid stone floor. The freezing wind violently howled into the cavern, bringing with it the absolute promise of slaughter. The monsters lowered their massive, heavily plated heads, their jaws dripping with freezing saliva, fully prepared to completely eradicate the trapped squad. But then, an incredibly strange, deeply unnatural phenomenon occurred. The terrifying second twist of the night violently altered the horrific battlefield geometry. The massive beasts suddenly locked their thick, muscular legs, skidding to a completely abrupt, grinding halt just 10 feet away from the helpless Valeri warriors, their glowing, predatory eyes violently dilated, rapidly scanning the dark interior in absolute, primal confusion. They aggressively flared their massive, slit-like nostrils, fiercely pulling in deep, heavy drafts of the cavern air. The cavern absolutely reeked. It did not smell of weak, terrified prey. It reeked powerfully, overwhelmingly, of their dead alpha, the incredibly dense, highly toxic scent of their fallen pack leader's deepest biological essence, its blood, its raw fat, and its highly guarded internal marrow, radiated intensely and heavily from the dark corner. The scent was incredibly concentrated, emanating directly from the steaming mouth, the blood-soaked hands, and the heavily stained tactical clothing of the small, heavily panting human engineer, to the highly sensitive, purely instinctual olfactory receptors of the alien pack. This tiny, two-legged creature was absolutely not a domesticated herbivore. The heavy, undeniable scent aggressively communicated a terrifying, biological lie. It told the pack that this small being was a vastly superior, infinitely more bloodthirsty apex predator that had just effortlessly slaughtered and completely consumed their strongest alpha. The towering monsters instinctively lowered their heavy, armored tails, their highly aggressive posture violently shifting into a deeply hesitant, deeply confused defensive stance. Seizing that microscopic, incredibly fragile window of absolute biological hesitation, Freddie Butler did not cower. He did not retreat into the dark recesses of the cave, fully weaponizing the roaring chemical fire still violently burning through his veins. The heavily injured engineer purposefully and aggressively dragged his ruined body forward. He forcefully wedged himself directly between the towering, helpless Valeri warriors and the massive, hesitating beasts. His hastily splinted leg dragged heavily behind him, scraping sharply against the rough stone. His highly analytical mind was actively calculating extreme tactical probabilities at a terrifying speed. In his left hand, he tightly gripped a massive, hollowed-out section of the alien femur, heavily packed to the absolute brim with highly volatile, thick, glowing blue beast fat and heavily concentrated marrow sludge. In his right hand, he firmly held his heavy-duty industrial plasma torch. With a swift, heavily calculated flick of his blood-stained thumb, he completely bypassed the primary safety interlocks and violently snapped off the heavy magnetic safety valve, fully exposing the raw, incredibly unstable ignition node to the freezing, oxygen-rich cavern air. "Come on, you ugly, overgrown lizards!" Freddy snarled aggressively, his raw, raspy voice echoing harshly against the cavern walls, heavily loaded with pure venom and absolute defiance. He was engaging in a highly dangerous, deeply calculated tactical misdirection. He heavily struck the metal casing of the plasma torch against the solid rock floor, creating a bright, blinding shower of yellow sparks. He intentionally, aggressively provoked them. He aggressively locked his completely bloodshot eyes with the largest, most heavily scarred monster of the newly arrived pack, violently baring his blunt, blood-stained human teeth in a completely unhinged display of primal aggression. He violently banged the heavy bone tube against the stone, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying confidence. Behind him, the veteran Valeri commander desperately squeezed his heavy, golden eyes shut. Profound, absolute despair washed over the massive alien. He was absolutely certain that the fragile human had completely lost his fragile mind. The alien warrior deeply believed that the sheer, blinding arrogance of this tiny, fleshy creature would instantly get him pulverized into fine, red mist within those massive, saw-toothed jaws. To the highly tactical, deeply logical mind of the Valeri, challenging a 3,000-pound apex predator with a broken leg and a broken tool was a completely suicidal, entirely futile gesture of false bravado. It was an absolute tragedy, unfolding in slow motion. The heavy, relentless provocation instantly shattered the fragile confusion of the new alpha beast. The massive biological lie was violently overridden by pure, unadulterated territorial rage. The immense creature let out a deafening, chest-rattling roar of pure, unadulterated fury, completely offended by the bold, incredibly arrogant challenge of the tiny creature standing before it. It violently snapped its massive jaws wide open, heavily exposing multiple rows of razor-sharp, incredibly lethal, serrated bone crushers. Thick strands of highly acidic saliva rapidly flew through the freezing air. The monster heavily dug its deeply clawed, incredibly muscular hind legs straight into the solid granite floor, rapidly gathering an immense, terrifying amount of kinetic energy. With a terrifyingly explosive burst of raw muscular power, the colossal biological killing machine launched its massive bulk directly forward through the freezing air. It violently lunged straight toward the exact, specific cubic inch of empty space where Freddy Butler was currently kneeling, heavily anchored to the ground, entirely unblinking, and fiercely aiming his crude, heavily improvised weapons with absolute, terrifying, millimeter-perfect precision. The colossal apex predator hung suspended in the freezing air for what felt like an absolute eternity. Its massive jaws were unhinged to their maximum physical limit, revealing rows of serrated, bone-crushing teeth and a dark, cavernous throat dripping with highly acidic saliva. In that exact fraction of a second, Freddy Butler executed his entirely insane tactical maneuver with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He did not flinch. He fiercely hurled the massive, hollowed-out bone tube, densely packed to the absolute brim with highly volatile biological fat and reactive chemical marrow, straight down the charging monster's gaping gullet. Without missing a single heartbeat, his right hand violently launched the heavy industrial plasma torch directly after the makeshift explosive. The glowing red ignition node was fully exposed and sparking wildly. Using every last ounce of remaining strength in his single, healthy human leg, Freddy planted his heavy boot firmly against the jagged limestone floor and violently launched his entire body backward, sliding deeply into the safest, narrowest crevice of the cave wall. The biological payload and the sparking plasma torch collided violently deep within the highly pressurized, highly acidic environment of the beast's massive primary stomach. The resulting chemical chain reaction was absolutely catastrophic. A confined, incredibly high-temperature, biological detonation violently ruptured the creature from the inside out. A blinding, deafening firestorm of pure, incandescent kinetic energy instantly vaporized the monster's thick internal organs. The sheer concussive force of the internal blast completely shattered its impenetrable outer armor, blowing dense chunks of thick ice and jagged bone shrapnel outward in a devastating radial shockwave. The blistering heat wave violently expanded, completely filling the narrow cave entrance with a roaring wall of unnatural blue and orange plasma fire. The two remaining giant stalkers, completely caught off guard by the blinding explosion, were violently lifted off their heavy feet by the immense shockwave. The raw kinetic force effortlessly blasted their massive, 3,000-pound bodies straight backward, sending them tumbling helplessly over the jagged edge of the deep, bottomless glacial ravine outside the cavern. The absolute, deafening silence that followed the explosion was heavy and deeply profound. The deadly knot of unavoidable slaughter was completely and permanently untied. Barely 15 minutes later, the massive, heavily armed rescue dropship of the Galactic Fleet descended through the clearing planetary blizzard, its heavy vertical thrusters melting the surrounding permafrost into thick clouds of white steam. The heavily armored rescue teams stormed out of the transport bays with their heavy weapons drawn, fully expecting to find a gruesome scene of total biological annihilation. Instead, the elite tactical medics stopped dead in their tracks, completely stunned by the utterly bizarre tableau before them. The terrifying, aggressive beasts that had previously massacred entire armored platoons were completely wiped out. And there, sitting entirely casually in the smoking, heavily charred ruins of the cave entrance, was the tiny human engineer. Freddy Butler had his crudely splinted, bloodied left leg comfortably propped up on the heavily scorched, massive skull of the alpha predator. He was calmly and methodically tearing off strips of heavily salted dried meat from his standard-issue emergency survival ration, chewing quietly, while the towering alien warriors around him were frantically loaded onto the medical stretchers. Exactly 1 week later, the atmosphere inside the pristine, heavily sterilized central infirmary of the Deep Space Station was intensely quiet. The veteran Valeri commander, having fully recovered from his severe hypothermic shock and profound cellular lethargy, sat rigidly at his heavy metallic desk. He was personally drafting a highly classified, Priority 1 emergency directive addressed directly to the High Galactic Council. His massive, scaled fingers moved purposefully across the glowing holographic keyboard as he aggressively updated the official Interstellar Biological Registry for the planet Earth. He permanently erased the previous, heavily flawed classification of fragile herbivores. In its place, he typed a new warning that would be instantly broadcast to every single military academy in the known galaxy. The new classification read, Extreme Adaptive Predators, followed by a strict, non-negotiable tactical mandate stating it is absolutely forbidden to corner them under any circumstances. Down in the massive, heavily vaulted central dining hall of the Fleet Command Station, The social hierarchy had completely and permanently shifted. The towering, heavily armored Valeri warriors, beings who had conquered countless hostile star systems, now actively altered their walking paths. They physically shrank their massive frames, lowering their heavy, horned heads in deep, profound respect every single time they walked past the isolated corner table where Freddie Butler was quietly eating his lunch. The famous, highly decorated Valeri commander slowly approached the humans' table. His massive hands were uncharacteristically hesitant as he gently placed a heavy metallic dining tray down on the smooth surface. Resting on the tray was a massive, heavily braised alien femur bone, still steaming intensely with rich, savory heat, entirely specially prepared by the fleet's master chef. The towering alien warrior lowered his deep, rumbling voice, speaking with an undeniable tone of profound reverence and sheer awe. "Can I learn to eat the core of this thing, to possess courage exactly like your species?" Freddie stopped chewing his synthetic bread. He slowly looked up at the towering alien warlord, a distinct, highly amused smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He casually picked up his standard metallic soup spoon and lightly tapped it against the side of the massive, steaming bone. "Just sit down," Freddie replied smoothly. "But I am warning you, it does not have the effect of creating fire." Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to our story today on Z Sci-Fi Stories. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let us know your location in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and thrilling, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code right there on your screen, or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support is exactly what allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them support their families while we continue to create even more amazing and epic sci-fi adventures just for you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.